Hello there, and welcome back to Coldman Survival, where we spend our evenings thinking slowly about the places on this planet where people still have to work and rest against the very worst that weather can offer. Tonight, we are leaving solid ground behind entirely. We are heading out into open, freezing ocean, to a place that has no roads leading to it and no lights on the horizon beside its own. To stand on a steel platform that rises out of the sea like something that should not be possible, and to ask a quiet question that turns out to be far more complicated than it sounds. How does anyone sleep out here on a night when the storm outside is trying its very hardest to make sure that they don't? Offshore oil platforms are strange places even on a calm day. They are small, floating, or fixed cities built for one purpose: extracting energy from beneath the ocean floor, and they are staffed by people who live and work in the same small collection of steel corridors for weeks at a time, far past the point where land is even a rumor on the horizon. But it is in winter, when the storms roll in off the open Atlantic or the North Sea or the Gulf, that these platforms reveal what they were actually built for: wind speeds that would ground commercial aircraft, waves that rise taller than a house, a sky that turns the color of wet concrete for days without a break. And somewhere inside all of that noise and motion, several dozen exhausted men and women who still need, more than almost anything else, 8 hours of quiet, uninterrupted sleep. Before we go any further, if you are watching this to drift off tonight, that is exactly what it's here for. You don't need to remember any of it. Let the sound of my voice sit somewhere in the background while your body does what it already knows how to do. And if your eyes want to close before the end, that is not failure. That is the whole point. And if you enjoy these long, quiet documentaries about the people who sleep in the hardest places on Earth, you're welcome to subscribe to Coldman Survival so that the next one finds you as easily as this one did. I'd love to know, before the storm properly arrives, where you are watching from tonight, and whether you have ever stood somewhere loud enough or cold enough that you wondered how anyone could possibly rest there, because that is precisely the feeling we are going to sit inside for the next little while. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to respect. The particular kind of respect you develop for people who have made peace with a level of difficulty that would keep most of us wide awake for a week. So let's go there now. Let's go out past the last stretch of coastline, past the point where phone signal disappears and the water turns the color of iron, to the platform itself, lit up against the dark like a small, determined city that has decided, quite calmly, that the ocean does not get a vote in whether it stands. The first thing you notice, if you are ever lucky enough to be flown out to one of these platforms, is how the scale of it stops making sense the closer you get. From a distance, across miles of empty water, it looks almost delicate, a scatter of lights and angular shapes balanced on stilts. But as the helicopter drops toward the landing pad, the platform grows and grows until it fills the entire window, and you begin to understand that what you are looking at is not a boat, and not quite a building either, but something closer to a small industrial town that someone has picked up and set down in the middle of the sea. Steel legs, sometimes driven deep into the seabed, sometimes anchored by systems complex enough to keep a floating structure almost perfectly still, rise up through the waves to support a deck the size of several football fields. On top of that deck sits the drilling equipment, the cranes, the flare stack burning quietly against the sky, and tucked into one corner, usually the section furthest from the noisiest machinery, the accommodation block. This is where several hundred people, on a large platform, or a few dozen on a smaller one, will eat, sleep, shower, watch television, call home when the signal allows it, and try to build something that resembles an ordinary life inside a structure that was engineered, first and foremost, to survive. New arrivals are told, usually within the first hour of stepping off the helicopter, that the platform will move. Not always visibly, and not in a way that feels dangerous, but the entire structure is built with a certain amount of give in it, a deliberate flexibility in the steel that allows it to absorb the punishment of wind and wave, rather than fighting it rigidly and eventually failing. Fixed platforms, driven into the seabed on legs of steel or concrete, are designed to withstand what engineers call a 100-year wave, a wave so large and so rare that statistically it should only occur once a century. And even then, the structure is built with a safety margin well beyond that worst case. Floating platforms, increasingly common in deeper water, use different systems entirely, some held in place by enormous anchor chains spread across the seabed, others using thrusters and computer-controlled positioning systems that constantly, silently correct the platform's location against the pull of current and wind. Either way, the underlying philosophy is the same. The sea will always eventually win a fight against something that refuses to bend. So the platform is built to bend a little, to groan a little, to sway by inches that most people never even notice, and to still be standing exactly where it started once the storm has passed through. This matters enormously for what happens inside, because the first thing every new worker has to learn, usually during their very first night on board, is which sounds are the platform simply being a platform, and which sounds would actually mean something has gone wrong. Veteran workers describe an entire private vocabulary of groans, creaks, hums, and vibrations that becomes as familiar to them as the sound of their own house settling at night. A particular low shudder that runs through the accommodation block during a strong gust. A rhythmic clank from somewhere below deck that repeats every few seconds when the swell reaches a certain height. The distant thud of the flare stack cycling. None of it means danger. All of it, to an experienced crew member, simply means that the platform is doing exactly what it was built to do, absorbing the ocean's bad mood one wave at a time so that the people inside never have to. For someone arriving for the first time, though, that first night can be genuinely difficult. Every unfamiliar sound registers as a possible emergency. Every faint sway feels like something worth reporting. This is one of the quieter, less discussed skills of offshore life, learning to relax into a level of ambient chaos that would put most people on solid ground on edge within minutes. Veteran workers often talk about mentoring new crew through exactly this adjustment, walking them through the accommodation block during a rough night, pointing out which vibrations are structural and expected, explaining the redundancy built into every system twice over, until the newcomer's nervous system slowly, gradually, learns to stop flagging ordinary platform behavior as a threat. It can take a full rotation, 2 or 3 weeks, before a new worker sleeps through an entire storm without waking at every unfamiliar groan. After that, something shifts. The same sounds that once felt alarming become, almost paradoxically, part of what makes sleep possible. A platform that is silent and still would actually be more worrying, because it would mean the structure had stopped responding to the sea at all, and a structure that stops responding to the sea is one that has started fighting it directly, which is exactly the situation the engineers spent years trying to avoid. There is something worth sitting with in that idea for a moment, out here in the dark with the wind rising outside. The platform's safety does not come from ignoring the storm or from being somehow separate from it. It comes from being built to feel it, to move with it in small, controlled, carefully calculated ways, so that the enormous forces of a winter storm at sea are absorbed gradually across the entire structure rather than concentrated anywhere they might do real damage. The workers who sleep here every winter are, in a very real sense, resting inside an object that is having a long, continuous, physical conversation with the ocean all night long. And once you learn to hear that conversation as safety rather than danger, sleep stops being something you fight for and starts being something the platform, in its own steel and quietly groaning way, actually helps you find. Living on an offshore platform is, first and above everything else, an exercise in accepting a kind of distance from the rest of the world that very few other jobs require. A typical rotation runs somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks on the platform, followed by an equal period back on shore, though the exact pattern varies by company, by region, and by the specific role someone holds out there. During those weeks on board, there is no possibility of simply deciding to leave. No car waiting in a parking lot, no train home if a family emergency arises. The only route back to land is by helicopter, scheduled around weather windows that can close entirely once a serious winter storm rolls in, sometimes for days at a stretch. This is one of the defining psychological realities of offshore life, a fact that every worker has to make some kind of internal peace with long before they ever step onto a platform for the first time. You are not just far from home. For the length of your rotation, you are somewhere that home cannot easily reach and somewhere you cannot easily leave. It would be easy to assume that this isolation makes rest harder to find, and in some ways, particularly during a worker's first few rotations, that is true. But most experienced offshore workers describe something closer to the opposite happening over time. The isolation, once it is fully accepted rather than fought against, becomes a kind of psychological relief. There is nothing to check on outside the platform's own steel walls, because there is nothing you could do about it even if there were. No commute waiting to be sat through. No errands left half-finished. No possibility of being pulled away mid-shift for something happening 30 miles down the road, because there is no road, and nothing 30 miles away except more water. Workers often talk about the strange simplicity this creates once the adjustment period passes. Life offshore narrows down to a short, repeating list of concerns: the current shift, the next meal, the next sleep period, the weather forecast, and eventually the return flight home. Everything else, every complication and distraction that fills an ordinary life on land, is simply out of reach, and therefore, oddly, out of mind. During a serious winter storm, this isolation deepens even further. Helicopter operations are among the first things suspended once wind speeds or visibility cross certain safety thresholds, which means that during the worst weather, the platform is not merely far from land, it is completely and unambiguously cut off. No new crew arriving, no one leaving, regardless of how badly they might want to. No supply runs. Communication continues, of course, through satellite systems that allow calls and messages home, though even those can be disrupted by the worst conditions, but the physical connection to the rest of the world simply does not exist until the storm passes and flying conditions return. Workers describe this particular kind of isolation as something you either learn to hold calmly or something that will make every single rotation genuinely difficult. There is no controlling the weather, no negotiating with it, no accelerating its schedule. The only available response is patience, paired with total trust in a structure and a safety system that has been specifically engineered for exactly this scenario. What is interesting, listening to workers describe this over years of rotations, is how directly this forced acceptance seems to feed into their ability to sleep well even during the roughest weather. Ashore, Most of us lie awake, turning over things we could theoretically still do something about. A message we should have sent, a decision we're deferring, a small errand nagging at the back of the mind. Offshore, during a storm, that entire category of low-grade worry simply does not apply. There is nothing to check, nothing to run out and handle, no possibility of the world requiring anything further from you until the wind drops. Several veteran workers describe this as one of the quieter, unexpected comforts of the job. The isolation that would terrify someone on their first night eventually becomes one of the very things that lets them rest, because it removes any illusion of control over anything beyond the platform's own walls, and along with that illusion, a great deal of the low background hum of worry that keeps so many people ashore staring at their ceilings at 2 a.m. There is also a particular texture to time itself out here that takes some adjusting to. Without the usual markers of a life on land, weekends, evening errands, the changing scenery of a commute, days on the platform tend to blur together, distinguished mainly by which 12-hour shift a worker is currently on and what the weather happens to be doing. Many workers describe keeping small personal rituals specifically to hold on to some sense of individual time within this blur, a particular route walked around the deck when weather allows, a specific song played before bed, a phone call home at the same hour every single day regardless of shift pattern. These small anchors, chosen individually rather than imposed by any official schedule, seem to matter enormously for psychological well-being during a long rotation, offering each person a private thread of ordinary life running quietly underneath the otherwise identical, storm-battered days. And then, of course, there is the return itself, the moment every rotation eventually builds toward, when the weather finally clears enough for the helicopter to lift off the pad and carry each crew member back toward land, back toward family, back toward the enormous relief of an ordinary bed that does not hum faintly with the memory of the sea. Workers often describe the first night home after a rough winter rotation as strange in its own way, too quiet, too still. The absence of the platform's familiar vibrations somehow harder to sleep through than their presence had been. It takes a night or two, most say, before an ordinary bed on solid ground starts to feel like rest again, rather than like something oddly, disorientingly calm. If the isolation is the emotional weather of offshore life, the routine is what keeps everyone standing upright inside it, and nowhere is that more true than during the worst of a winter storm. Every platform runs on a rigid, repeating schedule built around 2 12-hour shifts, generally referred to simply as days and nights, with each crew member assigned firmly to one or the other for the entire length of their rotation. This is not treated as a loose guideline. It is closer to the platform's own heartbeat, the fixed rhythm around which absolutely everything else, meals, safety briefings, sleep periods, recreation time, is built. And that rigidity, workers consistently say, is not something imposed on them against their will, so much as something they come to actively rely on, particularly once the weather turns dangerous. A typical day begins, for whichever crew is coming on shift, with breakfast served at a fixed hour in the galley, followed by a safety briefing that covers current conditions, any specific hazards created by the weather, and the day's planned work. These briefings take on particular weight during a winter storm, when outdoor tasks may be restricted or suspended entirely, and the crew's attention shifts toward monitoring rather than active drilling work. Musters, the practice drills where the entire crew gathers at designated assembly points to confirm everyone is accounted for, are treated with total seriousness regardless of weather, and during a storm, crews may be asked to remain closer to muster stations than usual, simply as a matter of prudent precaution. None of this is dramatic in the moment. It is administrative, almost bureaucratic in its calm repetition, and that, several workers explain, is precisely the point. A storm outside is chaotic by nature. The response to it, inside the platform, is deliberately, aggressively not. Meals are served at the same hours every single day of a rotation, storm or no storm, and workers describe this consistency as one of the most underrated stabilizing forces in offshore life. When the weather outside is at its most violent, when the platform is groaning and swaying and the windows show nothing but gray spray and darkness, walking into a warm, brightly lit galley at exactly the hour you expected, finding the same faces, the same rough weekly rotation of dishes, the same quiet conversations about nothing in particular, provides a kind of psychological ballast that is hard to overstate. It is one thing to know intellectually that the platform is safe. It is another thing entirely to feel that safety confirmed by the simple, repeated fact of dinner arriving on time regardless of what the ocean is doing outside the porthole. Sleep itself is scheduled with the same rigor. Night shift workers are expected to sleep during daylight hours, which requires genuine discipline and cooperation from the entire crew, since the platform continues operating at full capacity around the clock. Quiet hours are respected throughout the accommodation block. Heavy curtains and blackout systems are used in cabins to simulate night, regardless of what the sky outside is doing, and crew members moving through corridors during another person's designated sleep period are expected to do so quietly, almost instinctively, the way people naturally lower their voices near a sleeping child. This mutual respect for each other's rest, workers say, becomes second nature within the first few rotations. An unspoken agreement that everyone's ability to function safely depends on everyone else protecting the boundaries of the shift schedule, storm or no storm. What becomes clear, listening to enough offshore workers describe their winters at sea, is that the schedule is functioning as something closer to armor than simple organization. A severe storm removes almost every variable a person could normally use to orient themselves: daylight, calm water, the ordinary sounds of a quiet evening. In the absence of all of that, the schedule becomes the entire structure of meaning for each day. You know it is time to sleep, not because it feels like night, since a storm can make daytime look like midnight, and a clear moment at 2 a.m. look almost peaceful, but because the clock says it is time, and the entire platform, in its quiet, disciplined way, is built to support that fact, regardless of what the sky is doing. Several long-serving crew members describe this as the single biggest adjustment for newcomers, and also the single biggest relief once it finally clicks. The storm does not get to decide when you sleep. The schedule does. And a schedule, unlike a storm, is something the human mind can actually hold on to. There is a particular comfort, too, in the sheer repetition of safety procedure during rough weather. Storm protocols on most platforms are not improvised in the moment. They are rehearsed extensively, practiced during calm weather so thoroughly that by the time an actual severe storm arrives, the entire crew is essentially executing a routine they have already performed dozens of times before. Reducing non-essential outdoor movement, securing loose equipment, increasing monitoring frequency on key structural systems, confirming muster readiness. None of it requires panic or improvisation, because none of it is new. Workers describe watching genuinely inexperienced newcomers grow calm during their first real storm, specifically because they can see, in the unhurried, practiced movements of the veteran crew around them, that this has all happened before, many times, and the platform and its people know exactly what to do. By the time a crew member's designated sleep period finally arrives, somewhere in the middle of a howling winter night, with the platform swaying gently on its supports and the wind screaming past outside. The routine has already done most of the work that will let them actually rest. They know precisely what time it is. They know precisely what has already been checked, secured, and confirmed. They know precisely when their alarm will sound and precisely what the next 12 hours will look like. And within that enormous, deliberately engineered predictability, surrounded by the one genuinely unpredictable force on Earth, they close their eyes, and more often than not, they sleep. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that finally allows all of this discipline and acceptance to translate into actual, physical rest, is the accommodation module itself, the part of the platform specifically engineered, down to remarkably small details, to make sleep possible in an environment that seems designed to prevent it. Positioned as far as practically possible from the noisiest drilling and processing equipment, and raised several decks above the waterline. The living quarters on a modern offshore platform bear almost no resemblance to the utilitarian, purely functional spaces many people imagine when they picture industrial infrastructure at sea. They are, in fact, engineered environments in their own right, every bit as carefully considered as the structural systems holding the platform upright against the waves. The cabins themselves are typically small, shared by 2 or occasionally 4 crew members, depending on the platform and the specific role. But they are heavily insulated, both against the cold radiating in from the steel hull and against the noise generated by the platform's own machinery, and during winter storms, by the wind and waves outside. Modern platforms use layered insulation systems combining foam, mineral wool, and specialized acoustic panels specifically selected to dampen the low-frequency rumble that a large storm generates as it moves across open water. This matters enormously because low-frequency noise, the kind produced by heavy swell-striking steel legs or wind tearing across an exposed superstructure, is notoriously difficult for the human ear to simply tune out, unlike higher-pitched sounds which the brain learns to filter more easily. Engineers designing these spaces have to account specifically for this, building in enough acoustic dampening that the difference between a calm night and a full winter storm, from inside a cabin, becomes a matter of a faint background hum rather than anything approaching the violence actually happening outside. Temperature control inside the accommodation block is kept remarkably stable regardless of what is happening beyond the hull, generally held within a narrow, comfortable range through heating systems that draw on the platform's own power generation, itself designed with enough redundancy to keep functioning through the worst conditions the structure is rated for. This stability matters more than it might initially seem to, because the human body relies heavily on a comfortable, consistent temperature to fall and stay asleep, and few things disrupt rest more reliably than a room that swings between too warm and too cold over the course of a night. Workers frequently mention this as one of the details they took for granted until they thought about it directly. The simple fact that no matter how brutally cold and violent the wind is outside a porthole, their cabin remains, night after night, at almost exactly the same comfortable temperature it was the night before. For workers assigned to night shifts, blackout systems are used throughout the accommodation block to simulate proper darkness during what is, outside, broad winter daylight, since a storm's heavy gray skies can otherwise make the entire concept of day and night feel meaningless. Thick blackout curtains, sometimes supplemented by additional shutters, allow a night shift worker to create genuine darkness inside their cabin regardless of the hour, an essential tool for maintaining the kind of consistent sleep schedule that 12-hour rotating shifts demand over weeks at a time. Beyond the engineering, though, what several long-serving workers describe as most important is the small, deeply personal layer added on top of all this careful design, the little rituals and objects each individual brings to make an otherwise identical steel cabin feel like their own particular space. A specific pillow carried from home, worn into exactly the right shape over years of rotations. A handful of photographs taped to the inside of a locker door. A particular podcast or a specific playlist listened to at the same point in the evening routine every single night. Rotation after rotation, until the sound of it alone becomes a kind of signal to the body that the working day is genuinely, finally, over. A hot shower taken at the same hour, a specific corridor walked at the same slow pace before bed, small private habits that have nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with reclaiming a sense of individual identity inside a space built, first and foremost, for hundreds of people to share. It is this combination, the deliberately engineered stability of the accommodation module, layered underneath the small personal rituals each worker builds for themselves, that finally allows genuine rest to happen out here, night after night, through a winter that would keep almost anyone on land wide awake with worry. The storm outside continues exactly as it always does, indifferent, enormous, entirely unconcerned with the small, warm rooms tucked inside the steel structure it is currently battering. And somewhere inside those rooms, surrounded by insulation, stabilized temperature, careful darkness, and a scattering of small personal comforts carried from a life hundreds of miles away, someone finally, quietly, falls asleep. There is one more piece of this story worth sitting inside for a while, because it is the piece that ties everything else together, and it has less to do with insulation or scheduling than with something closer to trust. Every worker who spends enough winters offshore eventually develops a particular relationship with the storm itself, one that shifts, gradually, and almost without anyone noticing it happening, from fear toward something closer to familiarity, and eventually, for many, toward a strange kind of respect that borders on affection. The storm becomes, in a sense, a regular visitor. Loud, disruptive, occasionally alarming to newcomers, but ultimately known, predictable in its unpredictability, and never, in the memory of most experienced crew members, actually dangerous to the people sleeping soundly behind several layers of engineered steel and insulation. This shift does not happen quickly, and it is not universal. Almost every worker describes their first winter storm offshore as a genuinely difficult experience, a night or several nights of lying in a bunk listening to wind speeds that sound, from inside a cabin, like they belong to the end of the world, wondering whether the faint sway of the platform beneath them is ordinary or the beginning of something else. But rotation after rotation, storm after storm, that fear tends to soften into something more like recognition. Long-serving crew members describe being able to estimate wind speed fairly accurately just from the particular pitch of the noise outside their cabin window, the way a farmer might read weather from the color of a sky, or a sailor from the smell of the air. They know which sounds belong to a serious storm and which belong to a merely uncomfortable one. They know how the platform behaves at each stage, which vibrations intensify and then plateau, which ones are new and worth a second look, though genuinely new and unexpected sounds are rare, precisely because the engineering has been tested across so many previous storms already. Part of what allows this transition from fear to familiarity is the sheer weight of institutional knowledge sitting behind every platform currently operating in a serious winter storm zone. These structures are not improvised. They are designed against decades of accumulated weather data specific to their exact location, built to withstand conditions considerably more extreme than anything they are realistically expected to encounter, and inspected, monitored, and maintained on schedules that treat structural integrity as a continuous, ongoing process rather than a box ticked once during construction. Onshore support teams track incoming weather systems days in advance, feeding continuously updated forecasts to platform management, who use that information to adjust staffing, secure equipment, and in the most severe cases, evacuate non-essential personnel well before conditions become genuinely dangerous. By the time a storm's leading edge actually reaches the platform, in almost every case, it has already been anticipated, planned for, and prepared against for the better part of a week. This advanced planning matters enormously for sleep because it removes the element that makes bad weather genuinely frightening on land, the sense of being caught by surprise. Workers offshore rarely experience a storm as a sudden shock. They experience it as the arrival of something they have been tracking, discussing, and preparing for since the first forecasts appeared, which transforms the entire event from an emergency into something closer to a scheduled, if unpleasant, appointment. There is a particular kind of calm available to a person who has spent days watching a storm's projected path update gradually toward their exact coordinates, who has already helped secure loose equipment and confirmed muster procedures, and who finally, when the wind actually arrives, has nothing left to do except exactly what the schedule says, which very often means simply going to bed at the usual hour and trusting the structure to do the rest. That trust, several veteran workers explain, is really the final ingredient in all of this, the thing that allows every other piece, the engineering, the routine, the small personal comforts, to actually add up to real rest rather than merely the appearance of it. It is one thing to be told a platform is built to withstand a 100-year wave. It is another thing entirely to have personally slept through a dozen serious winter storms across several years of rotations and woken up each time to an ordinary morning, breakfast at the usual hour, the same faces in the galley, the storm already passing or already past, the platform exactly where it had been standing the night before. That accumulated lived experience becomes its own form of evidence, more persuasive to the nervous system than any engineering report could ever be. The structure has proven itself, storm after storm, and the body, eventually, learns to believe it. There is something worth carrying with you, out of all of this, as you drift toward your own rest tonight. Somewhere out on the open water right now, in exactly the kind of winter storm we have spent this evening describing, there are people lying in narrow, carefully insulated cabins, listening to wind that would keep most of us wide awake with worry, and sleeping anyway. Not because they have stopped noticing the storm, and not because they are somehow braver than the rest of us, but because everything around them, the steel, the schedule, the small personal rituals, the accumulated experience of every previous winter survived, has been built, slowly and deliberately, to make that rest possible. The storm rages on exactly as it always does, and inside it, warm, steady, and entirely unbothered, the platform keeps standing, and the people inside it keep sleeping, one quiet, engineered night at a time. For all the engineering we have spent this evening walking through, the steel, the insulation, the carefully scheduled shifts, there is one more layer to offshore life that workers consistently describe as just as important to their ability to rest through a winter storm, and it has nothing to do with structure at all. It is the simple, quiet fact of the people around them. A platform crew, particularly during a long winter rotation, becomes something closer to a small, temporary family than a workplace in any ordinary sense, and that closeness turns out to matter enormously when the wind outside is doing its very worst to keep everyone awake. Meals are where this becomes most visible. The galley on an offshore platform runs almost continuously, feeding whichever crew happens to be coming off shift or about to start one. and it functions as something closer to the platform's living room than its cafeteria. Long-serving workers describe the same handful of familiar faces appearing at roughly the same hours, rotation after rotation, trading the same gentle complaints about the weather, the same running jokes about whichever piece of equipment has been causing trouble that week, the same quiet, undemanding company that asks nothing more of a tired worker than their presence at the table. During a severe storm, when outdoor movement is restricted and the platform's usual rhythm of work gets compressed into whatever tasks can safely continue, the galley becomes even more central, a warm, brightly lit gathering point where the crew can measure, simply by looking around the room, that everyone is present, safe, and settling into the evening the same as any other night. This matters more than it might initially sound like it should, because isolation, as we discussed earlier, cuts both ways. It removes the small worries of ordinary life, but it also removes the ordinary social contact that most people rely on without ever quite noticing it. Family at the dinner table, friends after work, a partner beside them in bed. Offshore, the crew becomes the substitute for all of that, and workers who have spent many winters doing this job describe the bonds formed out here as unusually deep precisely because of how concentrated the circumstances are. You are not simply working alongside these people. You are eating alongside them, resting near them, weathering the same storm as them, trusting them with the same safety procedures for weeks at a stretch, with genuinely nowhere else to be. Several veteran crew members describe specific colleagues from years and even decades of rotations, people they may never see outside the context of the platform, and yet who they would trust without hesitation in an emergency. A particular kind of friendship, built entirely from shared difficulty rather than shared leisure. There is a specific kind of mentorship, too, that tends to happen naturally within this structure, usually without anyone formally assigning it. Experienced crew members, the ones who have slept through a dozen winters of storms already, take it upon themselves, almost as a matter of unspoken duty, to help newer workers through their first difficult rotations. This might mean nothing more dramatic than sitting with someone in the galley during their first serious storm, talking quietly about nothing in particular, simply providing calm, present company, while the wind screams outside. It might mean walking a new worker through the accommodation block, pointing out which sounds are ordinary and which would actually warrant concern, the kind of practical reassurance that no engineering manual can quite replicate. Workers describe this transfer of calm as one of the genuinely important, if rarely discussed, safety systems on any platform, every bit as real as the structural redundancy built into the steel itself, because a frightened, sleep-deprived crew member is a genuine safety risk, and a crew that looks after each other's rest, quite literally, keeps everyone safer. Off-duty hours, limited as they are during a working rotation, tend to be spent in small, familiar rituals that mirror, in miniature, the kind of social life most people build ashore. Card games in a shared recreation room, a movie put on in the common area, watched by whoever happens to be free at that hour, in various states of attention and exhaustion. Quiet conversations over tea in the galley late at night, between workers whose shifts have just ended and workers whose shifts are about to begin, a brief overlapping window where day crew and night crew cross paths and exchange the day's small updates. None of it is dramatic, and that, several workers point out, is precisely why it works. A storm outside is enormous, chaotic, and completely beyond anyone's control. The response inside, small games, shared meals, familiar company, gentle conversation, is deliberately, comfortingly modest in scale, a kind of ordinary human life carried on in miniature, entirely unbothered by how loud the wind happens to be getting outside the porthole. Physical fitness facilities, present on most modern platforms in some form, whether a small dedicated gym or simply a repurposed space with basic equipment, serve a similar psychological function beyond their obvious physical benefit. Workers describe exercise as one of the most reliable tools available to them for managing the particular kind of restless energy that builds up during a long rotation, especially during a storm, when outdoor work is limited and the crew spends more hours than usual confined to the accommodation block. A hard session on a stationary bike, or with a set of weights, several workers explain, does more than pass the time. It provides a controlled physical outlet for the tension that naturally accumulates when the body senses, on some instinctive level, that the environment around it is under genuine stress, even when the conscious mind knows perfectly well that the platform is safe. Falling into an exhausted, physically tired sleep after a good workout is, several crew members say, considerably easier than trying to will an anxious, understimulated body to rest. There is, too, a quieter, more solitary version of all this camaraderie, the private moments each individual worker carves out for themselves within an otherwise thoroughly shared existence. A cabin door closed for an hour before bed, headphones in, a favorite album played at exactly the same point in the evening, rotation after rotation, until the sound of it becomes its own small ritual of transition between the working day and rest. A worn paperback, carried out to sea for years, read a chapter at a time before the light goes off. These solitary habits exist alongside the communal ones, not in competition with them, and workers describe needing both, the reassurance of shared company earlier in the evening, and the quiet privacy of their own small rituals in the final minutes before sleep. What becomes clear, listening to enough of these accounts stacked one against another, is that the human relationships built out here function as a kind of second layer of insulation, every bit as real as the foam and mineral wool packed into the accommodation block's walls, just considerably harder to measure with an engineering instrument. The steel keeps the storm's physical force at bay. The schedule keeps each day psychologically anchored. And the crew, the familiar faces at dinner, the mentor who once talked a nervous newcomer through their first serious storm, the quiet company shared in a warm galley while the wind does its worst outside, provides something that no amount of structural engineering alone could ever quite replicate. The simple, deeply reassuring knowledge that you are not facing any of this completely alone. If there is one thread connecting every worker on every platform currently weathering a winter storm somewhere out on the open ocean tonight, it is the pull toward home and the particular, carefully managed rituals built specifically to satisfy that pull as much as circumstances allow. Communication with shore, once a genuinely difficult and expensive undertaking on offshore platforms, has improved enormously in recent years, though it remains, even now, something considerably more precious and more deliberately used than the casual, constant connectivity most people take for granted on land. Satellite communication systems allow most modern platforms to offer their crews some combination of phone calls, video chat, and internet access, though bandwidth remains limited compared to shore, and during the most severe storms, atmospheric conditions and equipment strain can degrade or occasionally interrupt the connection entirely. Workers describe planning their calls home with a kind of deliberate care that might seem old-fashioned to anyone used to endless, unstructured contact with family throughout an ordinary day. A specific hour set aside, usually timed carefully against both the worker's shift schedule and whatever time zone their family happens to be living in back on land, sometimes requiring genuinely awkward hours. A video call taken during what would otherwise be a worker's designated rest period, simply because it is the only overlap available between a rotating offshore schedule and an ordinary life ashore. This scarcity, several workers explain, changes the character of the contact itself. A call home is not a quick, distracted exchange squeezed between other tasks. It is often the single most anticipated event of an entire day, sometimes an entire week, particularly during a long rotation complicated by severe weather. Workers describe genuinely planning what they want to say, saving up small stories from their week to share, listening with unusual attention to the small details of an ordinary evening back home, a child's school day, a partner's minor frustration with traffic, the kind of everyday information that would barely register as noteworthy to someone living an ordinary life ashore, but which becomes, from several hundred miles out at sea, a small, treasured thread connecting them back to the life waiting for them on land. During the worst of a winter storm, when helicopter operations are grounded and the platform is genuinely, completely cut off from physical contact with shore, these calls take on additional weight. Workers describe reassuring family members specifically about the storm itself, explaining, sometimes for the 10th or 20th time across a career, exactly why the platform is safe, what redundant systems exist, why the noise their family can sometimes hear faintly in the background of a call is simply wind and structure rather than anything alarming. This becomes its own small recurring ritual within a career offshore. The patient, practiced reassurance offered to loved ones ashore who cannot see the calm galley, the familiar faces, the practiced, unhurried movements of a crew that has weathered this exact kind of storm many times before, and who therefore genuinely, rationally, are not afraid. There is also a quieter form of connection that does not rely on any signal at all. The small physical objects each worker carries with them across every rotation, specifically to hold some tangible piece of home nearby. A child's drawing, taped inside a locker. A partner's photograph propped against a bunk light. A specific ring or watch worn every single day regardless of the manual work it might interfere with elsewhere in a shift. These objects, workers explain, serve a purpose distinct from the phone calls and video chats, something closer to a constant, silent presence rather than a scheduled, temporary connection, a small physical anchor to an entire life, waiting on land that does not depend on satellite signal or storm interference to remain close at hand. The return home itself, at the end of each rotation, carries its own particular emotional weight, intensified considerably by a winter spent weathering serious storms. Workers describe the specific, almost disorienting relief of stepping off a helicopter onto solid, unmoving ground after weeks spent adjusting to a platform's constant, subtle motion. A kind of temporary vertigo that several workers say takes a day or two to fully resolve. But underneath that physical adjustment sits something considerably deeper. The simple, overwhelming relief of an ordinary embrace, a familiar bed shared with a partner rather than a narrow bunk shared with the memory of a storm. A child's voice heard in person rather than through a satellite delay. Several long-serving workers describe this return, rotation after rotation, year after year, as the single event that makes every difficult night offshore, every howling storm weathered inside a warm, insulated cabin, entirely and completely worth it. And then, inevitably, after a period of rest ashore that never feels quite long enough, the cycle begins again, the helicopter waiting, the platform rising back into view on the horizon, the familiar faces of the crew gathering once more in the same galley, ready to weather whatever winter has waiting for them this time. It is, several workers admit, a strange rhythm to build an entire working life around. Weeks of complete immersion in one small, difficult, storm-battered world, followed by weeks of complete immersion in an entirely different, ordinary one, but it is a rhythm that, once fully accepted, several workers say they would not trade for an easier, more conventional job on land, precisely because of everything it has taught them about resilience, about the particular comfort of a well-built structure and a well-built schedule, and about exactly how much genuine rest is possible, even in the very worst weather, when the right systems and the right people are standing quietly behind you. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an offshore platform during the handover between shifts, a small daily ritual that repeats itself twice every 24 hours, regardless of what the weather outside happens to be doing, and it is worth pausing on, because it turns out to matter enormously for how well an entire crew sleeps through a long winter rotation. As one shift's 12 hours end and the next begins, there is a brief overlap, sometimes only 20 or 30 minutes, during which outgoing and incoming workers exchange information, not just about the technical state of the equipment, but about smaller, more human things as well. How the swell has been building through the afternoon, whether the wind has shifted direction since the last check, which corridor had a loose panel rattling, and whether maintenance has already been out to look at it. This handover is treated with real seriousness on every platform, precisely because a gap in that shared understanding during calm weather is simply an inconvenience. But during a serious storm, it can matter a great deal more. What is less discussed, but just as important to the way people manage to rest out here, is the social fabric that gets built and rebuilt during these small daily exchanges. Offshore crews are, by necessity, small, tightly bound communities, drawn from wildly different backgrounds and often different countries entirely, thrown together for weeks at a stretch in a space with genuinely nowhere else to go. Workers describe developing a particular kind of closeness with rotation crewmates that differs from ordinary workplace friendship, closer in some ways to the bond described by people who have weathered a difficult journey together, because in a sense, that is exactly what is happening over and over, one winter storm at a time. There is no possibility of avoiding a colleague you find difficult, and equally no possibility of skipping a shared meal because you would rather be alone. Over the course of enough rotations, most crews settle into something that functions less like a workplace and more like a household, complete with its own habits, its own quiet jokes, its own unspoken systems of looking out for one another. This matters for sleep more directly than it might first appear. Loneliness and isolation, in almost every other context, are reliably associated with poorer rest. A racing mind with nothing to anchor it, worry that has no outlet. Offshore platforms sidestep a great deal of that particular difficulty simply because genuine solitude, in the sense of feeling unseen or unaccounted for, is almost impossible to experience out here. Someone always knows exactly where you are, because the muster system and the shift schedule require it. Someone always notices if you seem off, because there is nowhere for a change in mood to hide inside a community this small and this consistently in each other's company. Workers describe a particular, quiet comfort in this constant, low-level visibility, the sense that even during the loudest, most frightening stretch of a winter storm, you are never actually alone with it. Somewhere down the corridor, someone else is awake or sleeping or making tea in the galley, entirely unbothered, and that fact alone does a great deal of work in calming an anxious mind at the end of a long shift. Meals, again, turn out to be one of the quiet centers of this community life, not merely for the fixed, stabilizing routine they provide, which we have already spent some time with, but for the simple, ordinary conversation that happens around them. Offshore galleys are, without much exaggeration, one of the more important pieces of infrastructure on the entire platform, not because of anything mechanical, but because of what happens across the tables. Workers trade stories from home, complain gently about the weather, tease each other about small quirks and habits developed over months and years of shared rotations, and in doing so, build the kind of low-stakes, easy familiarity that makes an unfamiliar, difficult environment feel, gradually, like somewhere you actually belong. Several long-serving crew members describe specific colleagues they have sailed through a dozen winters with, people they might never have crossed paths with on land, who have become, through nothing more than repeated shared weeks at sea, something close to family. There is also, tucked inside all of this closeness, a quieter form of care that rarely gets mentioned directly, but that every experienced worker seems to understand instinctively. Crewmates keep a gentle, informal watch over each other's well-being during a difficult rotation, particularly during a long, punishing storm that keeps everyone confined to the accommodation block for days at a stretch. A colleague who seems unusually quiet at dinner gets checked on casually without making a production of it. A newcomer struggling to sleep through their first serious storm might find an experienced crewmate sitting with them in the galley at an odd hour, talking through nothing in particular, simply providing company until the worst of the noise outside passes and sleep starts to feel possible again. This informal, unofficial care network is not written into any safety manual, but workers consistently describe it as one of the most important, if least visible, systems, keeping everyone rested and steady through the hardest winter rotations. Recreation spaces, modest as they usually are, given how much of a platform's total space has to be devoted to drilling equipment and processing machinery, play their own small role in holding this community together. Most accommodation blocks include a shared lounge with a television, sometimes a small gym, occasionally a games room with a pool table or a dartboard, spaces where off-shift crew members gather in the evenings to unwind together before the next sleep period begins. During a winter storm, when outdoor recreation is entirely off the table and the wind outside makes even a short walk along an exposed corridor unpleasant, these indoor spaces become genuinely important, offering a shared, low-pressure activity that lets a crew simply be in each other's company without the more formal structure of a shift or a meal. Workers describe long winter evenings spent half watching a film together, the sound of the storm outside blending almost pleasantly with the quieter, warmer sounds of a room full of people who trust each other completely, before gradually peeling off toward their cabins as each person's designated sleep hour approaches. What becomes clear, spending enough time with the stories these workers tell about their winters offshore, is that community is not simply a pleasant side effect of platform life, but one of its genuine load-bearing structures, every bit as important, in its own quieter way, as the insulation in the cabin walls or the redundancy built into the platform's stabilization systems. A storm outside can be as loud and as violent as it wants to be. Inside, surrounded by people who know your habits, your history, and exactly how you take your coffee, who have sat with you through a dozen previous winters, just like this one, there is a kind of safety that has very little to do with steel, and everything to do with simply not being alone. And it is that safety, layered on top of everything else this platform has been engineered to provide, that finally lets an exhausted crew, night after night, storm after storm, close their eyes and rest. For as isolated as an offshore platform genuinely is, cut off from land by weather that can close every possible route home, for days at a stretch. It is not, in truth, cut off from the people who matter most to the crew living out here. Modern platforms are equipped with satellite communication systems specifically designed to keep workers connected to their families throughout even the longest, roughest rotations, and this thin, sometimes fragile thread back to an ordinary life on land turns out to matter enormously for how well people manage to rest through a difficult winter storm. Most platforms provide crew members with scheduled access to phone calls and video chat, usually through a shared communication room or, on newer and larger platforms, through personal internet access available directly from individual cabins. During calm weather, this connectivity is generally stable, allowing something close to a normal daily check-in with partners, children, and parents back on land. During a serious storm, however, satellite links can become genuinely unreliable, signal dropping in and out as heavy weather interferes with transmission, sometimes disappearing almost entirely for hours at a stretch during the very worst conditions. Workers describe this particular frustration as one of the harder emotional aspects of offshore life during winter. The sense of wanting badly to hear a familiar voice on a difficult night and simply not being able to, at least not reliably, until the weather eases enough for a clean connection to hold. And yet, most experienced workers describe finding their own way to manage this uncertainty, usually by building a rhythm of communication that does not depend on any single call succeeding. A brief message sent whenever signal allows, even a short line simply confirming that all is well and the storm is being handled exactly as it should be. A longer call attempted at the same hour every evening, understanding that on the roughest nights it might not connect, and simply trying again the following day. Families on land, in turn, often develop their own quiet patience with this rhythm over years of a partner's rotations, learning not to worry unduly when a call drops or a message arrives later than expected, trusting instead in the platform's own safety record and the simple fact that no news during a storm is almost always good news. There is something worth noticing in how this long-distance connection actually supports rest, rather than undermining it, once a family has settled into its own version of this rhythm. Workers describe the specific comfort of a short message sent just before their designated sleep period, even a single line, letting a partner or a parent know that the shift is done. The storm is loud but entirely within expected limits, and sleep is next on the list. That small act, closing the loop on the day before closing their eyes, seems to matter far beyond its brief length, allowing a worker to set down, if only temporarily, the part of their mind that is always quietly tracking how their absence is being felt back on land. And on the other end, a similarly brief reply, arriving whenever the connection allows it, does the same work in reverse, letting a family fall asleep themselves, knowing that their person, out there in the middle of a genuinely terrifying-looking storm, is safe, fed, and about to sleep exactly on schedule. Photographs, brought from home and kept somewhere close in almost every cabin, serve a quieter version of this same purpose during the long stretches when a call simply cannot connect. Workers describe glancing at a taped-up photograph of a partner, a child, a family pet, in the last few minutes before turning off the light, a small private ritual that has nothing to do with technology at all, and everything to do with carrying a piece of an ordinary life into an environment that otherwise looks nothing like one. Several long-serving crew members mention this as one of the very first things they set up in a new cabin at the start of each rotation, before unpacking almost anything else, understanding from long experience exactly how much that small, familiar image will matter 3 weeks into a rough winter storm at 2 a.m, with the wind screaming past outside and a long shift only just finished. There is also a particular kind of anticipation that builds over the final days of a rotation around the return home itself, and workers describe this anticipation as its own strange, useful tool for getting through the last, hardest stretch of a long winter tour. Knowing precisely how many days remain, precisely when the helicopter is scheduled, precisely which flight will finally carry them back toward solid ground and an ordinary bed, gives the final week of even the roughest rotation a clear, countable shape. That countdown, several workers explain, becomes its own kind of comfort during a bad storm near the end of a tour. A very concrete, very close reminder that however loud tonight happens to be, this particular chapter of isolation has an ending already fixed on the calendar, arriving in days rather than in some indefinite, unknowable future. What all of this points toward, ultimately, is a fact that might seem obvious once stated plainly, but that is easy to overlook amid all the engineering and scheduling that makes offshore life possible in the first place. The platform can be as well built as modern engineering allows, the routine as disciplined and reassuring as decades of institutional practice can make it, but none of that, on its own, would be quite enough to let a person rest easily through a genuinely violent winter storm, hundreds of miles from everyone they love, for weeks at a time. What finally closes that gap is connection itself, thin and occasionally unreliable as it can be out here, the simple, repeated, deliberately maintained thread back to an ordinary life on land. A message sent, a photograph glanced at, a countdown quietly tracked. Small things, none of them structural, none of them mentioned in any engineering report, and yet together they turn out to be exactly what lets a tired, isolated crew close their eyes each night and trust that everything, out here and back home both, is going to be perfectly fine until morning. There is a particular strangeness to being a night shift worker on an offshore platform during a winter storm, a kind of doubled darkness that takes real adjustment to live inside comfortably, and it is worth spending some time with, because it shapes an entirely different rhythm of rest than the one experienced by day shift crew. Roughly half of every platform's workforce is assigned to nights for the length of a rotation, which means waking in the late afternoon, working through the entire night while the rest of the world, and much of the platform's own daytime crew, sleeps, and finally returning to bed sometime after dawn, often just as a winter storm's gray morning light is beginning to seep, weakly, through whatever gap remains around a blackout curtain. For a night shift worker, the storm itself becomes something experienced almost entirely in reverse compared to everyone else on board. While day shift crew are winding down for sleep as the evening's weather worsens, night shift workers are only just beginning their 12 hours, walking out into corridors that lead toward the working sections of the platform precisely as the wind is climbing toward its most intense. There is something almost bracing about this, several night shift veterans explain, a sense of being the platform's quiet custodians through the darkest, roughest hours, monitoring systems, checking readings, keeping watch over machinery and structure alike, while most of the rest of the crew sleeps soundly, trusting entirely in the people currently awake to notice anything that might need attention. This responsibility, worn night after night across an entire rotation, becomes its own source of a particular kind of calm, rather than added stress, once a worker has enough experience behind them. Night shift crew describe developing an intimate, almost proprietary familiarity with how the platform behaves specifically after dark, during a storm, in a way that day shift workers, however experienced, simply do not encounter in quite the same concentrated form. They learn exactly how the wind sounds different once true night has fallen and the sky's usual faint glow disappears entirely. They learn which readings on which monitors are worth a second glance during the roughest hours, and which fluctuate normally without meaning anything at all. Over enough rotations, this specific nocturnal expertise becomes a genuine point of quiet professional pride, a sense of ownership over the hardest, least glamorous hours of platform operation. When a night shift finally ends, usually sometime in the early morning, whether the storm outside has begun to ease by then or is still at its full height, the transition to sleep requires its own discipline, distinct from anything a day shift worker experiences. Returning to a cabin as dawn breaks, however faint and gray that dawn might be during a heavy winter storm, and deliberately settling in for 8 hours of daytime sleep, runs directly against nearly every instinct the human body carries about when rest is supposed to happen. This is where the blackout systems built into every cabin earn their keep most directly, and where night shift workers develop their own careful personal rituals to help the body accept sleep at an hour it would otherwise resist. Several describe a consistent, deliberately unhurried routine, a hot shower first to wash off both the shift and, quite literally, whatever spray or condensation has found its way onto exposed skin during the walk back from an outdoor check, followed by heavy curtains drawn fully closed, a specific playlist or a particular white noise recording used consistently enough that its sound alone has become, after months of rotations, almost a direct trigger for sleep. There is an unexpected advantage, several long-serving night shift workers point out, in the storm's own noise during exactly this daytime sleep period, one that took them by surprise the first time they noticed it. A loud, consistent wind, a steady rhythm of waves against the platform's legs, functions almost like a very large, very natural white noise machine, a continuous, unchanging background hum that, once a worker has learned not to interpret it as alarming, actually helps mask the ordinary daytime sounds of a busy platform continuing its work just outside a cabin door. Footsteps in the corridor, distant machinery, the general daytime bustle of several hundred people going about their working day, all of it gets absorbed into the storm's larger, steadier roar in a way that a genuinely calm, quiet day, oddly enough, does not manage nearly as well. More than one night shift worker has admitted, with a kind of rueful affection, that they actually sleep somewhat better during a loud winter storm than during an unusually still, calm stretch of weather, precisely because the storm's own noise does so much of the work of blocking out everything else. Waking in the mid-afternoon, with a full night shift still ahead, and the winter daylight already fading fast this far north, or already gone entirely depending on the season and the platform's exact location, requires its own small transition ritual as well. Workers describe a fairly consistent sequence, checking the latest weather updates first thing, since conditions can shift meaningfully across an 8-hour sleep period, followed by a proper meal, since the galley adjusts its serving hours specifically to accommodate night shift crew waking mid-afternoon, and then a slow, deliberate re-entry into the working rhythm of the platform, checking in with day shift colleagues during the handover, catching up on anything that changed while they slept, before heading out to begin another 12 hours facing whatever the storm has decided to bring that particular night. Over an entire winter rotation, this reversed rhythm becomes its own complete, internally consistent way of living, distinct from, but every bit as stable as, the daytime pattern followed by the other half of the crew. Night shift workers describe genuinely enjoying certain aspects of their inverted schedule that surprise people who have never lived it themselves. A particular quiet camaraderie among the small group awake together through the platform's darkest hours. A sense of shared ownership over the toughest, least visible part of keeping the operation running safely through a storm, and, for some, simply a personal preference for the specific texture of those long, wind-battered nights over the busier, more crowded rhythm of an ordinary day. By the end of a rotation, most experienced night shift workers have built a version of rest every bit as reliable and complete as their day shift counterparts, simply arranged around a different clock, held together by the same combination of engineering, ritual, and hard-won familiarity, with a storm that, by now, has very little left to teach them, that feels genuinely new. Behind every calm night of sleep on an offshore platform, hidden well beneath the visible routines of shift changes and galley meals and blackout curtains, sits an enormous, largely invisible architecture of redundancy, the kind of engineering that most workers rarely think about directly, precisely because it has been built to work so reliably that thinking about it directly is almost never necessary. It is worth pulling back the curtain on this system for a moment, because understanding just how many separate layers of protection stand between a sleeping crew and the storm outside goes a long way toward explaining why rest, out here, is genuinely possible rather than simply an act of stubborn willpower. Every critical system on a modern offshore platform, power generation, structural monitoring, communication, life support, is built with what engineers call redundancy, meaning that no single system is ever relied upon alone. Power typically comes from multiple independent generators, so that the failure of any one unit does not leave the platform without electricity, heating, or the pumps that keep the structure's various safety systems functioning. Structural monitoring involves networks of sensors distributed across the platform's key support points, continuously measuring stress, vibration, and movement, feeding that information back to control rooms staffed around the clock, where trained engineers watch for any reading that falls even slightly outside expected parameters. Should any single sensor fail or return an anomalous reading, neighboring sensors and cross-checking systems are specifically designed to catch the discrepancy, ensuring that no genuine structural concern could possibly go unnoticed simply because of one piece of malfunctioning equipment. This layered redundancy extends into the platform's emergency response capability as well, an entire system built and rehearsed specifically for scenarios that, statistically, almost never occur, but that the platform is nonetheless prepared for, as though they might happen tonight. Lifeboats, positioned at multiple points around the platform, are inspected on rigorous schedules and designed to be launched safely even in severe weather conditions, considerably worse than an ordinary winter storm. Evacuation procedures are drilled repeatedly throughout every rotation, not merely explained during an initial safety briefing and then forgotten, ensuring that every single person on board, regardless of role or seniority, knows exactly where to go and exactly what to do should the platform ever need to be evacuated. Firefighting systems, structural shutdown protocols, and emergency shelter areas within the platform itself add still further layers, each one designed to function independently of the others, so that no single point of failure could ever cascade into a genuine crisis without multiple separate systems having to fail simultaneously, a scenario made deliberately, statistically remote by decades of careful engineering practice and regulatory oversight. None of this redundancy is visible during an ordinary night's sleep, and that, several platform managers explain, is precisely the intended outcome. A well-engineered safety system is not one that constantly reminds its users of its own existence, but one that operates so quietly and so reliably in the background that the people relying on it can simply get on with an ordinary life, ordinary meals, ordinary conversations, ordinary sleep, without needing to hold the engineering consciously in mind at all. Workers do not fall asleep each night actively thinking about backup generators or structural sensor networks. They fall asleep trusting, at a level built up over months and years of rotations, that all of it is there, functioning exactly as designed, entirely independent of whether anyone happens to be thinking about it in that particular moment. This is, in a sense, the quiet, unglamorous payoff of an enormous amount of engineering effort that most people, understandably, never see or think about at all. A modern offshore platform represents one of the more remarkable examples of applied engineering anywhere on the planet, an entire small, self-sufficient settlement built specifically to withstand conditions that would be genuinely dangerous almost anywhere else on Earth, and built with such deliberate, layered redundancy that the people living inside it can, night after night, simply close their eyes and rest, trusting a system they rarely think about directly to keep functioning exactly as intended, storm after storm, winter after winter, for as long as the platform itself continues to stand. There is a particular quality to the morning that follows a genuinely severe winter storm offshore, a specific kind of relief that experienced workers describe in remarkably consistent terms, regardless of which platform, which ocean, or which particular storm they happen to be remembering. It rarely announces itself dramatically. More often, it arrives quietly, almost anticlimactically, in the simple, gradual realization, somewhere over breakfast, that the platform has stopped swaying quite so noticeably, that the wind outside the galley windows has dropped from a scream to something closer to an ordinary blustery morning, and that an entire crew, having slept through the worst of it exactly as scheduled, is sitting down to the same meal at the same hour that they always do. This particular, understated relief is worth pausing on, because it captures something important about the whole experience of offshore winter life that can be easy to lose amid all the engineering and routine we have spent so much time describing. The point of everything we have covered, the insulation, the redundancy, the schedule, the small personal rituals, the careful maintenance of connection back to family on land, is not to make the storm feel dramatic or heroic. It is precisely the opposite. It is to make an objectively extraordinary situation, sleeping soundly through hurricane-force winds and towering waves on a platform in the middle of the open ocean, feel, from the inside, almost entirely ordinary. And the clearest proof that this goal has been achieved arrives the following morning, when a storm that would have made headlines on shore has simply become, for the people who lived through it, another completed night shift, another round of breakfast, another day's work waiting. Once conditions allow outdoor tasks to resume, workers describe checking in with each other over that first post-storm breakfast, not with any particular drama, but with the same easy, familiar conversation that marks every other morning of a rotation. How did you sleep? Did you hear that shift in the wind around 4? Any word yet on when the helicopter schedule might resume? These are small, practical questions, asked in exactly the same tone a person might use discussing an unremarkable Tuesday, and that tone itself carries real meaning. It reflects an entire crew's collective, hard-won confidence that the platform, the routine, and their own accumulated experience were more than sufficient to carry them through whatever the ocean decided to throw at them overnight. Outdoor work resumes gradually once wind speeds drop back within safe operating limits, and this return to ordinary daytime activity carries its own small satisfaction. Workers describe stepping back out onto the main deck for the first time after a serious storm, checking equipment, confirming that everything secured before the weather worsened remains exactly where it was left, and finding, almost without exception, that it does. The platform has done its job. The routines held. The crew rested, worked their shifts, and came through the other side exactly as they were trained and prepared to do. There is a quiet, unshowy satisfaction in this outcome that several long-serving workers describe as one of the genuine, if rarely discussed, rewards of offshore life, the simple, repeated experience of facing something genuinely difficult and finding, morning after morning, storm after storm, that you and your platform were entirely equal to it. And so the rotation continues, one 12-hour shift at a time, One storm weathered and left behind, one countdown toward the eventual flight home ticking a little further along. The wind may pick up again before the week is out, the swell may build once more toward another rough night, but by now, several storms into a long winter rotation, none of that carries quite the same weight it once did for a first-time worker standing on the helicopter pad, seeing the platform's true scale for the first time. It has simply become the job, extraordinary by any outside measure, and yet, from the inside, held together by good engineering, good routine, and good people. Something that finally, reliably, allows for a good night's sleep. There is a slower, quieter kind of adaptation happening inside every offshore worker's body across a long winter rotation, one that has less to do with steel and insulation than with something much older and much harder to engineer directly. The internal clock that every human being carries with them, regardless of where in the world or how far out to sea they happen to find themselves. Chronobiologists, the researchers who study exactly this internal clock, describe it as a system remarkably sensitive to light, temperature, and routine, and remarkably stubborn about resisting sudden changes to any of the three. Offshore platforms, almost uniquely among modern workplaces, ask this ancient internal system to perform a genuinely difficult trick, staying stable and functional, despite 12-hour rotating shifts, weeks spent entirely away from a natural daily rhythm, and, during winter storms specifically, an external environment that offers almost none of the usual cues, daylight, calm skies, a quiet evening, that the body typically relies on to know when rest is supposed to happen. What makes offshore adaptation possible, workers and researchers both explain, is that the body's internal clock, while stubborn, is not actually rigid. Given enough consistency, it can be persuaded to shift its expectations almost entirely, provided that consistency is genuinely maintained. This is precisely why the platform's rigid shift schedule, the fixed meal times, the deliberately maintained darkness for night shift sleepers, matters so much more here than it might in an ordinary job with more flexible hours. A worker's internal clock does not particularly care whether the sun is technically up or down outside a cabin window during a storm, since the storm's heavy cloud cover often makes that distinction nearly meaningless anyway. What it cares about is whether meals, light exposure, and sleep periods repeat with genuine reliability, day after day, because that reliability is precisely the signal the body uses to build a new, stable rhythm around. Several occupational health researchers who study offshore work describe this adaptation process as happening in fairly predictable stages across the first week or so of any new rotation. The initial 2 or 3 days typically bring some genuine sleep disruption as the body's existing rhythm, built up over weeks at home on an ordinary daytime schedule, resists the sudden shift to platform hours, particularly for anyone newly assigned to night shift work. By the middle of the first week, most workers report their sleep beginning to stabilize meaningfully, aided enormously by the platform's rigid consistency. And by the second week, the new rhythm generally feels close to fully settled, indistinguishable in its own way from an ordinary, comfortable sleep pattern, just one built around a different clock than the one followed back on land. This adaptation, once achieved, turns out to be remarkably resilient to exactly the kind of disruption a winter storm might otherwise cause. A worker whose internal clock has fully settled into platform rhythm does not particularly need calm weather to sleep well, because their body is no longer relying on external cues like weather or daylight at all, having instead built its expectation entirely around the platform's own internal consistency, its meal times, its light and dark cycles, its shift patterns. This is one of the quieter, more remarkable outcomes of the entire system we have spent so much time describing, that a properly adapted worker can sleep essentially as well during a screaming winter storm as during a perfectly calm night, because their body has stopped depending on the weather to tell it anything at all. There is an interesting wrinkle in this adaptation process worth mentioning, one that experienced workers describe consistently, even though it rarely appears in any formal research literature. The return home at the end of a rotation requires its own readaptation, often surprisingly, in the opposite direction from what a person might expect. Workers frequently describe genuine difficulty readjusting to an ordinary land-based sleep schedule during their first few nights back home, precisely because their body has spent weeks building a stable rhythm around platform life, and that rhythm does not simply switch off the moment the helicopter lands. Several describe lying awake at home, in a bed far quieter and calmer than any platform cabin during a storm, feeling strangely unsettled by the very stillness that most people would consider ideal for sleep. It generally takes 2 or 3 nights, roughly mirroring the adjustment period at the start of a rotation, before an ordinary home schedule feels comfortable again, at which point, inevitably, it will soon be time to fly back out and begin the entire adaptation process over again in reverse. What this reveals, ultimately, is something worth sitting with for a moment as you drift toward your own rest tonight. The human body is remarkably adaptable, far more so than most of us give it credit for in ordinary daily life, capable of building genuine, stable comfort around almost any consistent rhythm, provided that rhythm is actually maintained with real discipline. Offshore workers are not simply tolerating a difficult schedule through sheer willpower each winter. Their bodies are quietly, gradually rebuilding an entire internal sense of day and night, comfort and rest, around whatever consistent pattern the platform provides, storm or no storm, until eventually, the distinction between a calm night and a violent one stops mattering nearly as much as most of us, safely on land, might assume it would. Every long-serving offshore worker seems to carry at least one storm in their memory that stands apart from all the others, a particular night or stretch of nights that gets brought up, usually with a kind of calm, almost fond seriousness, whenever conversation among crewmates turns toward genuinely difficult weather. These are not stories told to frighten or impress. They are told, more often, in the same steady, matter-of-fact tone used to describe any other difficult but ultimately manageable experience. And listening to enough of them reveals a great deal about how thoroughly this particular kind of hardship eventually gets absorbed into ordinary professional memory. One veteran platform supervisor, with close to 2 decades of North Sea winters behind him, describes a storm early in his career that pushed wind speeds and wave heights well beyond what he had personally experienced up to that point. A storm severe enough that all outdoor movement was suspended entirely for the better part of 2 full days. Non-essential personnel were consolidated into the most structurally protected sections of the accommodation block, and the entire crew settled in for what everyone understood would be a genuinely uncomfortable stretch of waiting. What he remembers most clearly from those 2 days, though, is not fear, but a kind of communal steadiness that settled over the crew almost immediately. Senior workers calmly walking newer crew members through exactly what to expect. The galley continuing to serve meals at the usual hours despite the platform's noticeable, near-constant motion, and an entire community of people simply getting on with the deliberately unremarkable business of waiting out a storm that the platform itself, all evidence suggested, was handling exactly as designed. He describes finally managing to sleep somewhere in the middle of the second night, not because the storm had eased, since by his account it had not, but because the accumulated fatigue of 2 days spent in heightened readiness eventually simply outweighed the noise and motion outside, and because, by that point, the platform's continued steady presence beneath him had become its own form of proof that the engineering was holding exactly as it should. He woke the following morning, he recalls, to weather that had genuinely begun to ease, and to a crew already settling back into ordinary shift routine, as though the previous 2 days had been nothing more than an unusually loud stretch of an otherwise normal week. A different worker, a communications technician who has spent winters on platforms across several different regions over the course of her career, describes a particular storm remembered less for its intensity than for a specific, small moment of unexpected calm in the middle of it. Woken briefly in the small hours by an especially forceful gust, she recalls walking to the small window in her cabin, watching sheets of spray and rain lit up briefly by the platform's own deck lighting, and feeling, rather than fear, something closer to a strange, private awe at the sheer scale of what was happening just beyond a few layers of steel and glass. She describes going back to bed within minutes, entirely unbothered, the moment having shifted from anything approaching alarm into something closer to simple appreciation for the size and power of the ocean she happened to be temporarily living on top of. What is striking, gathering enough of these particular remembered storms from enough different workers, is how consistently they resolve, in memory, toward calm rather than toward lingering anxiety. Nobody describes these nights as traumatic. Nearly everyone describes them, eventually, as formative in a much gentler sense, moments that taught them directly and permanently exactly how much the platform, the routine, and their own accumulated experience were capable of absorbing without anything actually going wrong. These remembered storms become, over the course of a career, a kind of personal evidence library, specific proof carried individually by each worker, that the worst nights they have personally witnessed were handled entirely without incident, evidence considerably more persuasive to an anxious mind at 2 a.m. than any engineering report could ever manage to be on its own. New workers, hearing these stories told calmly around a galley table during their own first difficult rotation, absorb something valuable from them beyond the specific details of any particular storm. They absorb the tone itself, the steady, unhurried, faintly amused manner in which experienced crew members discuss weather that would genuinely terrify most people encountering it for the first time. And that tone, more than any individual fact about wind speeds or wave heights, is often what finally allows a nervous newcomer to relax enough to sleep through their own first serious winter storm. The story is never really about the storm itself. It is about the demonstrated, lived proof that the platform and the people on it have already faced this and come through it, more times than anyone still bothers to count. If there is one space on an offshore platform that carries slightly more emotional weight than its purely functional purpose might suggest, it is the galley and the person running it. And it is worth spending a little extra time here, because food out on a platform during a genuinely rough winter storm ends up doing quite a lot more work than simple nutrition. Offshore cooks, often working in genuinely challenging conditions themselves, preparing full meals in a galley that may be swaying gently, sometimes not so gently. On its supports, are consistently described by crew members as among the most important people on any platform, not for any technical role in keeping the structure safe, but for the specific, considerable comfort their work provides during the hardest stretches of a winter rotation. A good offshore cook understands, whether or not they would ever phrase it this particular way, that they are providing something closer to psychological infrastructure than simple catering. Meals served at fixed times, regardless of what the weather is doing, form one of the central anchors of the entire daily schedule we spent time with earlier. But the specific quality and care put into those meals matters considerably beyond the schedule alone. Workers describe favorite dishes served on particular days, familiar comfort foods that reliably appear during the roughest weather, almost as though the galley staff have learned, across years of shared rotations, exactly which meals a tired, storm-weary crew needs most on the hardest nights. Several platforms maintain genuine culinary traditions passed down through successive cooks and catering teams, specific soups or stews associated with the worst winter weeks, treats saved specifically for the night a serious storm finally begins to ease, small culinary rituals that have nothing officially to do with safety or engineering and everything to do with morale. The galley itself, as a physical space, tends to be one of the warmest, most inviting areas on the entire platform. Deliberately so, workers explain, since it functions as the closest thing to a communal living room that platform life offers. During a winter storm, when outdoor movement is restricted and the accommodation block's other recreational spaces can feel slightly subdued under the weight of the weather outside, the galley often becomes the genuine social center of the entire crew. Workers drifting in and out across the day, not always for a scheduled meal, but simply for the warmth, the light, the smell of something cooking, and the easy company of whoever else happens to be there. There is a particular comfort several long-serving workers describe in the simple, repeated sight of the same galley staff, rotation after rotation, year after year, greeting each returning crew member with the same familiar warmth, remembering individual preferences, small dietary needs, the particular joke that gets made every single time a certain dish appears on the menu. This continuity, built up over years of shared rotations between catering staff and crew, becomes its own quiet form of the community and connection we spent time with earlier. One specific, reliable thread of familiarity running through every single rotation, regardless of which particular storm happens to be raging outside that season. And on the hardest nights, when the wind is at its loudest and sleep still feels a little distant, there is real comfort available in something as simple as a familiar bowl of something warm, served by a familiar face at exactly the hour everyone has learned to expect it. A small, deeply human anchor holding steady against an entirely inhuman storm. There is a particular kind of day on every offshore platform that stands apart from the otherwise steady, repeating rhythm of a winter rotation, the day when crew change finally arrives, and half the people currently on board are due to fly home while an entirely fresh crew arrives to take their place. During calm weather, this day unfolds smoothly, almost routinely, helicopters cycling in and out across a scheduled window, outgoing crew handing over their responsibilities to incoming replacements with the same practiced efficiency that marks every other handover on the platform. During winter, though, crew change day carries an additional layer of tension entirely dependent on weather, since a storm arriving at exactly the wrong moment can delay the entire operation, sometimes by hours, occasionally by days, leaving an exhausted, outgoing crew waiting with growing impatience for a weather window that finally allows the helicopters to fly. Workers describe this particular waiting period as one of the more psychologically difficult stretches of an entire rotation, precisely because it arrives at the exact moment when a person's mind has already, understandably, begun turning toward home. The disciplined patience that carries a crew calmly through an ordinary mid-rotation storm becomes noticeably harder to summon when that same storm is standing directly between an exhausted worker and their long-anticipated return to family. And several experienced crew members admit, with a kind of rueful honesty, that a delayed crew change during bad weather tests a different, more personal kind of patience than the routine, professional patience required earlier in a rotation. What helps considerably, workers explain, is that this exact scenario is neither new nor unexpected. Every experienced offshore worker understands, from their very first rotation onward, that winter crew changes carry an inherent accepted risk of delay, and this understanding, built into the culture of offshore work from the very beginning, does a great deal to soften what might otherwise be a genuinely frustrating experience. Rather than treating a delayed flight as some sort of personal misfortune, most workers have learned to treat it simply as an ordinary, if unwelcome, feature of winter offshore life, no different in kind from an unusually rough shift or an especially loud night, something to be waited out calmly rather than fought against. There is also a particular kind of support that kicks in specifically during these delayed crew changes, drawing on exactly the community bonds we spent time with earlier. Outgoing crew members, their own bags already packed and waiting, often find themselves genuinely cared for by colleagues during this stretch of anxious waiting. Extra consideration at mealtimes, a slightly lighter workload where operational needs allow it, simple company and conversation specifically aimed at making the waiting feel less isolating. Several workers describe specific memories of colleagues going out of their way during a delayed crew change, understanding intuitively that waiting to go home is its own particular kind of difficult, deserving its own particular kind of kindness. When the weather finally clears enough for helicopters to resume, the mood on a platform shifts almost immediately. A palpable, shared relief moving through the accommodation block as outgoing crew gather their bags and make their way toward the helipad, and incoming crew, having likely faced their own delayed departure from land, finally begin arriving to take their place. This handover, brief as it usually is, carries its own small rituals, outgoing workers walking incoming replacements through anything unusual that occurred during the recent storm, offering the same kind of calm, informal reassurance that experienced crew have offered new arrivals since the very first rotation this particular platform ever ran. And then, finally, the outgoing crew boards their flight, watching the platform shrink behind them through the helicopter window exactly in reverse of how it once grew enormous in front of them on their very first arrival, heading home toward a rest that, however good the platform's own engineered comfort might be, still carries its own particular, irreplaceable relief. The story of how offshore platforms became capable of offering the kind of calm, reliable rest we have spent so much of this evening exploring is, in its own way, a story about decades of accumulated engineering caution built up gradually across an entire industry that has spent a very long time learning, carefully and deliberately, exactly what winter storms at sea are capable of, and building ever more thorough safeguards against every lesson learned along the way. It is worth spending some time with this broader history, not because any single event needs to be dwelt on in detail, but because understanding how thoroughly this industry has studied its own hardest weather helps explain why today's platforms are able to offer the kind of dependable, engineered calm that lets an entire crew sleep soundly through conditions that would once have been considered genuinely untested. Early offshore platforms, built in the middle of the 20th century as the industry first began moving operations away from land and into open water, were considerably more modest structures than the platforms operating today, built with less accumulated understanding of exactly how severe ocean storms could become in the specific regions where drilling was beginning to expand. As operations moved into progressively harsher environments, first into the Gulf of Mexico, later into the far more punishing conditions of the North Sea, engineers gathered an ever-growing body of direct experience regarding wave heights, wind loads, and structural stresses considerably beyond what earlier calculations had assumed. And every new piece of that accumulated understanding fed directly back into the design standards governing the next generation of platforms. This gradual, continuous process of learning and refinement has produced today's remarkably conservative design philosophy, one in which platforms are built not merely to survive the worst weather a particular region has historically experienced, but to withstand conditions considerably beyond that historical worst case, incorporating substantial additional safety margin specifically to account for the inherent uncertainty in predicting truly extreme, rare weather events decades or centuries into the future. Engineers refer to this margin using specific statistical terms: the 100-year wave, the 1,000-year wave, describing storms so severe that, based on historical data, they would be expected to occur only once every century or millennium, respectively. And modern platforms are built with structural capacity that comfortably exceeds even these deliberately extreme, statistically rare benchmarks. Alongside this structural conservatism, the entire regulatory and operational framework governing offshore safety has grown correspondingly thorough over the same decades. International bodies and national regulators establishing increasingly detailed standards covering everything from structural inspection schedules to emergency evacuation procedures to the specific redundancy required in critical safety systems. Every platform currently operating is subject to regular, rigorous inspection, both from onboard crew conducting continuous monitoring and from independent regulatory bodies conducting periodic, thorough external review, ensuring that the enormous body of accumulated engineering knowledge represented by modern design standards is actually consistently applied in practice rather than simply existing as theory on paper. What this decades-long history of careful, continuous refinement ultimately provides, for the crew currently asleep somewhere out on the open ocean during tonight's storm, is a platform built on a genuinely deep foundation of accumulated caution, every design choice informed by an enormous body of prior experience, every safety margin set deliberately, conservatively wide, every system built with redundancy specifically because earlier generations of engineers, working through decades of gradually accumulating understanding, decided that redundancy mattered enormously and built that conviction permanently into the standards governing every platform that came after. There is something worth appreciating in this quietly remarkable achievement, easy to overlook amid the more immediate, human details of shift schedules and galley meals and small personal rituals we have spent this evening exploring. An entire industry, over the better part of a century, has methodically studied its own hardest possible conditions and built, gradually, deliberately, an entire category of structure specifically engineered to make sleeping safely through those conditions not merely possible, but genuinely, reliably ordinary. The worker settling into their bunk tonight, somewhere out on a winter sea with the wind screaming past outside, is resting on top of decades of careful, accumulated engineering caution, every layer of it invisible, and every layer of it quietly, doing exactly its job. A platform's year has its own particular shape, distinct from almost any other kind of working life, built around the slow, seasonal turning of the ocean itself, rather than around the calendar most people on land use to organize their time. Winter, for offshore crews working in regions like the North Sea, the North Atlantic, or the more exposed stretches of the Gulf of Mexico during storm season, represents the most demanding stretch of this yearly cycle, the months when storm frequency and intensity both climb toward their highest point, and when the routines, engineering, and community we have spent this entire evening exploring are tested most thoroughly and most often. But winter, however long and difficult it can feel in the middle of a particularly rough rotation, does eventually turn, gradually, toward something calmer, and workers describe this seasonal shift as its own quiet, welcome rhythm running underneath the shorter, daily and weekly rhythms of platform life. The turn itself rarely arrives all at once. Workers describe noticing it first in small, almost imperceptible details: a slightly longer stretch of daylight during a day shift, a storm that, while still serious, does not quite match the ferocity of the ones from a month earlier, a particular softening in the color of the sky during the brief calm periods between weather systems. Meteorological teams onshore, the same teams responsible for tracking incoming storms throughout the winter, begin noting this shift in their own forecasts well before it becomes obvious to anyone actually living on the platform, and this advanced knowledge filters gradually through the crew. A quiet, welcome piece of news shared over breakfast, another storm behind us, and the forecast for the coming weeks looking gentler than the one we just came through. This seasonal easing brings its own particular relief, distinct from the nightly relief of getting through any single storm. Workers describe a specific lightness that settles over an entire platform as the worst of winter finally passes, outdoor work resuming with fewer interruptions, recreational time on deck becoming possible again for the first time in months, and a general sense, shared across an entire crew, of having collectively come through the hardest stretch of the working year. Several long-serving workers describe this transition as their favorite time to be offshore, not because the work itself changes dramatically, but because the accumulated tension of an entire winter's worth of storms finally, gradually, releases, replaced by calmer seas and a lighter, easier rhythm to daily life on the platform. There is something worth noting in how this seasonal cycle shapes the way experienced workers think about winter itself, viewed not as an isolated, dreaded ordeal, but as one recurring, expected phase within a much larger, familiar yearly pattern. Just as the routines we explored earlier transform each individual stormy night into something predictable and manageable, this broader seasonal awareness transforms an entire difficult winter into something similarly bounded and familiar, a known temporary phase within a yearly cycle that workers have already lived through many times before, and know, with real confidence, will eventually turn towards something easier. This knowledge, carried quietly through the hardest weeks of any given winter, does real work in sustaining both morale and rest. The simple, repeated understanding that however loud tonight's storm happens to be, spring is coming, as it always does, and the platform, and everyone on it, will still be here to meet it. Among all the different kinds of severe weather an offshore platform might face during a winter storm season, there is one particular hazard that receives its own distinct set of procedures, its own specific vocabulary among experienced crew, and its own particular place in offshore safety training, and that is ice. In the coldest regions where platforms operate, sustained freezing temperatures combined with heavy spray thrown up by rough seas can result in genuinely significant ice accumulation across a platform's exposed surfaces, decks, railings, equipment, and structural elements alike, gradually coating in a layer of frozen spray that, left unmanaged, can add substantial unplanned weight to the structure and create serious slipping hazards for anyone required to move across exposed areas. Platforms operating in genuinely cold regions are built and staffed specifically with this hazard in mind, incorporating heating elements into critical walkways and equipment housings, deploying dedicated desing teams during the coldest stretches of winter, and maintaining strict procedures governing exactly when and how outdoor movement is permitted once ice accumulation reaches certain thresholds. Workers describe this as one of the more physically demanding aspects of winter offshore work. Dedicated desing shifts spent methodically clearing ice from railings, walkways, and safety equipment. Work that requires genuine physical effort in extremely cold, often still actively icing conditions, but work treated with exactly the same calm, practiced professionalism as every other routine safety task we have discussed this evening. The psychological experience of living alongside this particular hazard, workers explain, follows a pattern familiar from everything else we have covered tonight. Genuine caution and respect during a first exposure to serious icing conditions, gradually replaced by calm, practiced familiarity as experience accumulates. New workers are trained extensively in recognizing dangerous ice buildup, understanding exactly which areas of the platform require particular caution, and knowing precisely which procedures govern outdoor movement once conditions cross specific safety thresholds. This training, reinforced through repeated drills and, eventually, direct lived experience, transforms ice from a source of genuine anxiety into simply another well-understood, well-managed feature of winter platform life. One more item on the long list of hazards. This entire system of engineering, training, and routine has been built specifically to handle. What is worth noting, listening to workers describe their relationship with ice specifically, is how thoroughly the platform's engineering anticipates this exact hazard. Heated walkways in the most critical areas, specific de-icing equipment maintained and ready throughout the winter season, clear, well-rehearsed protocols governing exactly when outdoor movement becomes restricted. None of this happens by accident or improvisation. It reflects the same decades of accumulated engineering caution we explored earlier, applied specifically and deliberately to one particular winter hazard among the many this industry has spent generations learning to manage safely. And for the crew sleeping soundly inside the accommodation block on a genuinely icy winter night, this careful advance preparation means one more source of potential worry has already been thought through, planned for, and handled long before it ever needed to keep anyone awake. Beyond the shared spaces and communal rituals we have spent considerable time with this evening, every individual offshore worker eventually develops their own private way of filling the quieter hours of a long winter rotation. Small personal hobbies and pursuits that have little to do with the platform's official routines and everything to do with each person's own particular way of finding calm inside an environment that offers, by its very nature, limited space and limited variety. These individual pursuits, workers consistently describe, matter enormously for long-term well-being across years of repeated rotations, offering each person a genuinely personal outlet distinct from the shared, communal rhythms of shift work, meals, and crew camaraderie. Reading emerges across countless worker accounts as one of the most consistently popular offshore pastimes, and it is not difficult to understand why. A good book requires no additional equipment, takes up minimal space in an already compact cabin, and offers a genuinely complete escape from the immediate environment, a mental journey somewhere entirely different from the platform and its storms, however loud the wind outside happens to be. Several workers describe specific, beloved routines built around reading, a chapter or two before sleep each night regardless of shift pattern, an entire long novel worked through slowly across a single rotation, a particular genre favored specifically for its calming, undemanding qualities during the roughest weeks of winter. Other workers describe more hands-on pursuits, model building, intricate needlework, small woodworking projects completed piece by piece across successive rotations, activities that offer the particular satisfaction of steady, visible progress on a personal project entirely separate from the platform's own demanding high-stakes work. There is something worth noting in how consistently these hobbies favor patient, incremental progress over anything requiring large, dedicated blocks of uninterrupted time, a reflection, perhaps, of how offshore life itself is structured, 12-hour shifts and scheduled sleep periods leaving relatively modest, if reliably repeating, windows of genuinely free time each day. Music features prominently as well, whether through listening, a carefully curated collection of albums or podcasts built up across years of rotations, or, less commonly but memorably, through actual instruments, several platforms maintaining small collections of guitars or keyboards available in shared recreational spaces for anyone inclined to play. Workers describe evenings spent listening to music together in the platform's communal lounge, a particular kind of easy, low-pressure togetherness that fits naturally alongside the community bonds we explored earlier, music providing a shared backdrop to conversation rather than demanding anyone's full attention. Physical exercise, where platform facilities allow it, offers still another outlet. Small onboard gyms providing a genuine, if modest, opportunity for the kind of physical activity that many workers describe as essential for managing the particular stresses of confined, isolated offshore life, especially during a long stretch of winter weather that keeps everyone indoors far more than usual. Workers describe building consistent exercise routines specifically around their shift schedule, a session immediately after waking, before a shift begins, becoming, for many, as reliable and important a part of daily platform life as any of the official routines we have spent this evening exploring. What unites all of these individual pursuits, however different they are from one another, is the particular function they serve within the broader system of rest and resilience this entire evening has been exploring. Engineering keeps the platform standing. Routine keeps the days organized. Community keeps everyone connected. And these small, deeply personal hobbies, chosen individually by each worker according to their own particular temperament, provide the final, quietly essential piece, a genuine, private sense of ownership over at least some portion of each long day, however loud the storm outside continues to be. There is a version of this story that unfolds entirely on land, quietly, in the ordinary houses and apartments where offshore workers' families wait out the very same winter storms we have spent this evening exploring from the platform's side. And it is worth turning our attention there briefly, because the resilience required offshore has its direct, less discussed counterpart in the resilience required at home. Partners, children, and parents of offshore workers develop their own particular rhythms around a loved one's rotation schedule, their own coping strategies for the specific uncertainty that comes with knowing, throughout the roughest winter weeks, that someone they care about deeply is currently out on the open ocean facing exactly the kind of weather that makes headline news on shore. Families describe building their own version of the routine and ritual we explored earlier aboard the platform itself, checking weather forecasts for the specific region where a partner's platform operates, developing an informal, personal familiarity with wind speed thresholds and storm categories that would mean very little to someone without a loved one currently offshore. This informal weather literacy, several partners describe, becomes its own quiet coping mechanism, transforming an otherwise abstract, frightening idea, a loved one facing a winter storm at sea, into something considerably more specific and, in its own way, more manageable. A particular storm system with a particular projected path and a particular expected intensity. Something that can actually be tracked and understood rather than simply worried about in the abstract. Communication rhythms, mirroring the ones we explored from the workers' side earlier, matter enormously to families waiting at home as well. A brief message received just before a partner's designated sleep period, even a single line confirming the day is done and rest is next, provides real, tangible reassurance, allowing a family on land to settle into their own evening with genuine confidence that all is well out on the platform. Families describe developing their own patience with occasional communication gaps during the worst storms, understanding, often through years of a partner's rotations, that a missed call or a delayed message during genuinely severe weather reflects nothing more than temporary satellite disruption, not any cause for actual concern. Children of offshore workers, several parents describe, develop their own particular understanding of a parent's schedule remarkably early, learning to track rotation calendars with real precision, counting down toward a parent's return with the same countdown enthusiasm that might otherwise be reserved for a holiday or a birthday. Families describe building specific traditions around a parent's return from a difficult winter rotation, a particular meal prepared, a particular activity planned, small rituals that mark and celebrate the safe conclusion of another difficult season, reinforcing, for an entire family, the same sense of successfully weathered hardship that the offshore crew themselves experience directly. What emerges from listening to these onshore accounts, alongside everything we have explored from the platform's own perspective this evening, is a fuller, more complete picture of exactly what it takes to sustain this particular kind of working life across an entire winter season and across an entire career. It is not simply engineering and routine holding steady out on the open ocean, though both of those matter enormously. It is an entire, extended community, spanning both the platform and the ordinary houses and apartments waiting patiently on land, each side developing its own particular rhythms, rituals, and quiet resilience, together forming a complete system capable of carrying an entire family and an entire crew safely through even the hardest winter storms. As we come to the end of this particular evening's investigation, it is worth taking one last slow look at everything we have gathered together, out here on the open winter sea, far from anything resembling an ordinary night's rest. We began with a simple question. How does anyone sleep through a storm violent enough to make headlines on shore? And we have spent this entire evening discovering that the answer is neither simple nor singular, but rather an enormous, carefully layered system, built gradually across decades of accumulated engineering caution and sustained nightly through routine, community, and countless small personal rituals that together transform something that sounds, on paper, almost impossible into something that experienced offshore workers describe, quite genuinely, as simply their job. We have seen how the platform itself, engineered to bend rather than fight against the ocean's enormous forces, becomes, once its particular language of groans and vibrations is properly learned, a source of reassurance rather than alarm. We have seen how isolation, that would frighten almost anyone during their very first rotation, gradually transforms into a kind of psychological relief, an entire, complicated world outside, temporarily reduced to a short, manageable list of immediate concerns. We have seen how a rigid, repeating schedule becomes its own form of armor against a storm's essential unpredictability, and how an entire community, built slowly across years of shared rotations, provides a form of safety that has as much to do with simply not being alone as it does with any structural engineering. We have sat with the specific, careful design of the accommodation module itself and with the small personal rituals, a particular pillow, a familiar photograph, a specific playlist that each individual worker builds to make an otherwise impersonal steel room feel genuinely like their own. We have followed a night shift worker through their own particular inverted rhythm of rest and traced the enormous, largely invisible architecture of redundancy standing quietly behind every calm night's sleep. We have sat with remembered storms, softened by time and repetition into calm, almost fond professional memory, and spent time in the platform's galley, understanding exactly how much comfort a familiar meal, served by a familiar face, can provide during the hardest stretch of a difficult winter. We have followed the particular tension and relief of crew change day and traced the broader, decades-long history of engineering caution that makes today's platforms so remarkably capable of handling conditions that would once have seemed genuinely untested. And we have followed the seasonal turning of an entire working year, the particular hazard of ice, the small personal hobbies that sustain each individual worker, and finally, the quieter, less visible resilience required of families waiting patiently on land, mirroring in their own ordinary houses the very same careful, steady rhythms holding an entire crew safely through the winter, out on the open sea. If you have made it this far, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, I hope some small measure of that steadiness has settled over you as well. Somewhere out there right now, in exactly the kind of storm we have spent this evening describing, an entire crew is sleeping soundly, trusting decades of careful engineering, a familiar routine, and each other to carry them safely through until morning. Perhaps, tonight, you can borrow just a little of that same trust for yourself and let whatever storm of your own day happens to be passing outside your window simply pass, while you too, finally, quietly, drift off to sleep. If this documentary helped you settle in tonight, you're welcome to leave the video playing softly in the background. And if you'd like more long, quiet journeys like this one, you can subscribe to Coldman Survival so the next story finds you exactly when you need it. Good night, wherever you are, and sleep well.